and welcome to another interview of Reopen Project. This time we have the honor to invite Dr. Gaspar Miklos Tamas from Hungary. He lives in Budapest and he is the foremost Hungarian intellectual. And as any good intellectual, he is not easy to classify. He used to be dissident, liberal, Marxist, and I am sure that there are many other labels which can be attached to him. And we will discover some of them during our interview. Thank you for joining us, Gaspar.
Thank you too for having me.
So my first question is, after 1989, the Hungarian political life has been shaped by the opposition between a neoliberal left and the national conservative right, represented by Viktor Orbán. How would you define your own position and how your position evolved throughout the years, since the 1980s, throughout the 1990s, and then after 2000? So would you sort of share with us your intellectual trajectory?
Well, Viktor Orbán wasn't leading the right from '89. He was himself dyed-in-the-wool neoliberal and very anti-clerical and very anti-nationalist, and all against everything that he represents now. And we have been both liberals. I was a little bit to the right of him in '89-90. He was the leader of a small party and I was the leader of a large party at the time. And now he's the leader of a large party and of the country, and I'm a leader of nothing. Nevertheless, the development of Hungary is like the other ex-socialist countries' development. The individual stories may vary, but the essence is the same. The disappointment in market capitalism and its material and moral and sociological consequences. There is a resistance from the left, a weak one, and there is a resistance from a traditional East Central European right that has been always anti-capitalist, anti-European, and anti-Western since the second half of the 19th century. That is nothing new about that. And just look at the Czech Republic. Czech Republic is led by Andrej Babiš, who is not exactly a dissident, is he? Now, exactly the contrary type of person. And so we have now, very interestingly, the same sort of iron curtain between West and East as we had before '89. The Western countries, with more or less justification, are accusing East European countries of being oppressive, ignoring human rights, not being genuinely pluralistic, being nationalist. The old accusations that went on from 45 to or 48, 49 to '89, and in part they were in existence since the second half of the 19th century. The accusations brought against Hungary, for example, today, have been brought by the British and the French press in the 1880s, 1890s, when old, greater imperial Hungary was persecuting the ethnic minorities, the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Serbs, and others. And the reaction was, at the time, from the political elites of Hungary, that the West is unfair to us, it's unkind to us, they're not nice to us, and Vienna played the role that Brussels plays now.
If I may sort of now jump into what you just said, but there are still big differences between Central European countries, because if you mention Babiš, you correctly say the Czech Prime Minister, you correctly say that he was not dissident. He was actually, he was in a prominent position in the 1980s because he worked in the foreign trade companies.
I know.
But he does not represent what you just said about your right, being sort of conservative, national-oriented, anti-capitalist, anti-European. So that's something which I see in Poland. I'm not sure that I see it's probably in Hungary, but it's not in Czechia. We don't have actually.
I don't think you're right, actually.
Yeah?
I think that Mr. Babiš and Mr. Zeman are quite similar types to what we see in Bulgaria, in Macedonia, in Albania, and so on. You two are an East European country, very much of an East European country, with the typical reactions and resentments, the love for Russia, the rejection of the European Union. And the forms, the ideological forms are different slightly.
I do not defend them, but
I know you're not, but they are rather familiar to me.
But
I mean, all that public opinion against Europe is just like everywhere.
But they are rather different in their intellectual generation.
There are differences.
They do not come from this conservative right, actually.
Nor do the Hungarian ones. Genuine conservatives don't exist in Eastern Europe. No. Well, these are all disappointed liberals, disappointed ex-communists, and disappointed others.
Yeah.
And genuine conservatism needs what? Needs a traditional elite. We don't have that, because the communists have annihilated them to the extent that they existed at all. Because don't forget that both in Bohemia and Moravia, to give it the old name, and in Poland and in Hungary, actually the elites were German-speaking and partly foreign. It was pretty dramatic in the Czech lands, where, of course, from the Middle Ages, German power has annihilated the Czech nobility. It wasn't so dramatic in Poland and Hungary, but still, capital was always Austrian and foreign. All our towns have been German towns. In the 1880s, Pest was still a German city. The greatest circulation newspaper was in German in the 20th century. And this is totally forgotten. Totally forgotten. Nobody speaks German any longer. That's totally disappeared. It's a very rootless thing, East European conservatism. After all, conservatives today in the West are one version of modernity, but our modernity has been created by state socialism. Most buildings, industrial and residential, have been built in those years, and many of our psychological and sociological structures have been built up in those years. We are different. We are not like the West. Our resentments, our crises, and our sorrows and our passions are distinctly different. Of course, there are analogies, consumerism and such like. Those are the same thing everywhere, because we are all irreligious moderns. So therefore, pleasure, sensual pleasure, consumption, joy, etc., leisure are popular everywhere. And that explains why the East European countries are still in the European Union. Why are the East European countries still in the European Union? Because they want accessible jobs on the German labor market, and the Austrian labor market. And in general, the main reason is money and not commonality of civilization, human rights, secular humanism, Reformed Christianity or whatever, or even Marxism. No. And there's a deep resentment against the West, but without a real nostalgia. Without a real nostalgia. Instead of nostalgia, we have a sort of affectionate irony towards the former regime. Like we had the ironic nostalgic irony in Schweik towards the monarchy. This is the same thing. We are all Schweik's children. And
so how would you define the Central European conservatives? Because you say that they are very different from...
Well, that's the extreme right. We don't have any other kind of conservatism. I don't have. That's racism, chauvinism, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And conservatism is called conservatism in America because there's a combination of modernism and a few social and moral things, especially regarding sexuality, that make the difference. But there's just one point, and that you must observe that sexuality is a point that divides humankind. It divides, for example, the churches, abortion, marriage, family, homosexuality, etc., and it divides societies as well. But this is just one element. This is just one element, and it's not the other aspects of conservatism that are based on a real affection and affirmation of the past. On this, every conservatism is based, and to the extent to which this goes to the dogs everywhere, look at England, genuine old-time conservatism is about to vanish, but so is old-time liberalism. That is splitting in the middle and going either to the right or to the left. And there is, of course, no socialism. It's the greatest change. In almost 200 years, it is the first time that we don't have a socialist challenge to capitalism. So it's a huge change.
So if you say that the Central European conservatism is basically extreme right, what stands against it? What is the alternative in the current landscape? Because you say
I'll tell you.
We don't have liberalism,
it is fear.
Socialism. So what's there actually?
It is fear. It is not liberalism, it is not socialism, but fear of tyranny, fear of things getting out of hand, fear of crisis, fear of persecution, fear of what you see in contemporary Russia, contemporary Belarus, etc., or Serbia, which is a one-party state in the midst of Europe, a one-party state that aspires to a membership in the European Union, which is just crazy. And but there you go. And people, of course, don't want that. So on the one hand, people would like to keep some sort of relaxed political attitudes from the side of the state, a little pluralism, private life being respected, people being left alone. We are, all of us, we are more individualists than the Westerners. And the common cause, the body politic, civil society, these are not ideas for East Europeans. Family, my children, my wife, my lover, my father, so all this, my friends, my drinking companions. So there's a lot of affection. We are not nasty, there are lots of affection, a lot of friendliness and so on and so forth, but no social sense, no real social solidarity, no old-fashioned patriotism, nothing like that. Because, hating gypsies is not patriotism.
Would you say that this is the legacy of the communism, or is it something which
I
is
wouldn't.
prevented?
No. the so-called communist societies were pretty conservative societies in all respects, including sexual morality and all that. And they tried to keep as much, after a while, from the 60s, to keep some sort of national tradition alive, to inspire people to put up with dictatorship and have some sort of psychological and moral satisfaction. So this is one of the reasons, and part of course, of the communist legacy, of workers' movement legacy, a great respect for high culture. All those libraries and theaters and cinemas and cheap books and all that kind of thing was very much part of communist society. And that was a stage quality about it that Czech literature had made great fun of, always, being satirical about it, very, very fun, in a very funny manner. We all loved that. And, Hrabal and the rest of them. And Hrabal is still one of the most popular writers in Hungary among all. I mean, more popular than Hungarian writers and Western writers. Really, people love him. Still being published and republished. But we are very close in that respect to the Czechs.
Speaking about the literature, what do you think about Kundera?
Well, not much these days. I was very fond of him when we were younger, but I must confess that I haven't thought of him in years. It's just something in my past. But yes, he was a good writer, of course.
You said that actually that many people got disappointed that the liberals turned into something else. It's also your case, I suppose. So are you also a disappointed liberal or not?
Well, that was 30 years ago when I was a disappointed liberal, and 25 years ago, something like that. And I was a liberal for a very short while. I was a leftist before, an anarchist, and which doesn't make much sense today, I must say. It is a beautiful idea, and I'm still affectionate towards it. I love it. I mean, anarchists are the sweetest people, and well, I'm among political people, I mean. But no, I just had become a Marxist, and I'm a Marxist ever since, which doesn't mean that I can be, or anybody can be, a Marxist in a political sense. For me, Marxism mostly is a critical social theory and a critical political philosophy. Socialism as such, in a large sense, including Saint-Simon and Lassalle and Proudhon and Bakunin and everybody, and social democracy and communists. It is a chapter of history. It is an enormously important chapter, and we should know and think more about it, because it's not less important than the Renaissance. But we are still too close to it. And our perspective is still very narrow and very low-slung. It's not very elevated. But we must realize that whatever we might feel about it, it was for 200 years after the demise of the French Revolution, it was the great promise of humankind. And I don't mean only the Marxist movements. But of course, that was the most important. But still, there were other traditions, and not all of them very nice, actually. I'm not fond of Saint-Simon, but certainly he is the real founder of socialism, not Marx. And so that is terminated. But a capitalism without socialism never existed. It's the first time in history that capitalism doesn't have a real challenger. In the past, capitalism had challengers from the right, monarchy, aristocracy, the Catholic Church, etc. And on the left, socialism, workers' movement, which was huge and important, and many other people, not only workers, were on its side. This was a genuine and huge movement. Well, the left challenger has disappeared. What we have as a left is a moderate version of the liberal mainstream, and slightly more egalitarian than the rest, but otherwise the same. And at the right, you have well, of course, aristocracy and the monarchy have lost their importance, but the church that still exists, well, not in Czechia, of course, which is the most atheist country, but in other parts. But even for an important minority, even there, of course, it's present. But that is like liberalism, it's split in the middle. The old establishment churches, the Lutherans, the evangelic church in Germany, Austria, that's even in Slovakia, etc., even here, but here is a very small church. Lutherans are a very small sect here, are liberal, and the Anglicans in England and the Episcopalians. Well, this is the upper middle class churches. These are the upper middle class churches. And those, like the whole of the upper middle class, are going to the left. But those are the people that are politically correct and pro-LGBT and pro-immigration and pro-ecology and so on and so forth. You know who is now the president of the German Evangelic Church, the greatest church in Europe? Well, it's a young female student, 22 years old, still in school. She is the president of the greatest European church.
But what
lives in a dormitory.
What happened with the idea of social justice, economic equality? These were actually
Well, these exist, but this is not socialism.
No? What's that?
Well, not characteristically. Social justice is an idea, basically, that is common between liberals and socialists. I'm not thinking, people think that liberals are neoconservatives, which is ridiculous. Most liberals are like John Rawls, and most liberals are in favor of a greater social justice, greater distribution, and so on and so forth. Those that people call, especially in Eastern Europe, call liberals, those are neoconservatives, representatives of the establishment that have very little to do with the liberal tradition. No, socialism was, of course, for equality, as long as we lived in capitalism. But an end to exploitation means that there's no source of inequality. Destroying exploitation, property, money, etc., means that social injustice doesn't have where to start from. So socialism was a deeper and more radical enemy of capitalism than these post-war social democrats and others were. Although I happened to read the Bad Godesberg Declaration of German Social Democracy from '63, that is considered and was considered by communists to be an act of treason. Okay, open it and you'll be surprised. It begins with the phrase, "Our aim is the end to capitalism and the conquest of socialism." Okay? We are against the private property. We are against this and that and other. But of course, we won't fight for this with revolutionary methods. So Bad Godesberg is mostly still half of a century after Bernstein, is still a reformist document that refers to method rather than to substance. And so today, nobody would dare to publish such a manifesto And, parties like the Linke in Germany are much to the right of the Bad Godesberg manifesto. But thank God, only people like myself are reading old, dusty party manifestos, and nobody remembers.
Does it mean actually that everyone is liberal today?
In a way, people are, yes, and all are hating liberalism. Yes, because you see, there's an element there which was so important only in America once upon a time, namely that, already Werner Sombart has asked the question why there's no socialism in the United States. He said this and that and the other, but the main reason was, of course, the blacks. Any kind of large general welfare system and system of social justice and progressive taxation, etc., and large state investments in social development, education, health, culture, etc., well, of course, will offer great advantages to the least advantaged, and those are people of color. Here, liberalism ends. And because people are liberal today, but also they're racists. And this is why in America, the black problem, although now they are going to have a black Latino majority. So that's a new situation. That's a new situation because demographic changes are such that you can't really say that blacks and Hispanics are a minority in the United States. Yeah, they are arithmetically a minority, but they're such a large part of the people that they don't count as a minority any longer. But in Europe, it is, of course, the Roma, but mostly the immigrants who seem to be at the receiving end of the state largesse in the social democratic liberal way. And people hate this. People don't want to recognize equal rights, especially social and economic rights, to the disadvantaged. And that, of course, is one of the most important social cleavages everywhere. And now, of course, we'll be joined by similar problems that the middle class won't give up their way of life to make a sacrifice for an improvement of the climate situation. Again, the young middle class won't wear masks in public because of the corona epidemic. And so there are a few new phenomena at which egalitarianism is defeated.
But when you talk about the European middle class, the European middle class is pretty squeezed, actually, because, I mean, their economic position has been deteriorating in the last 20, 30 years because of the globalization and competitive pressures from other parts of the world.
Well, this is only partly true. For example, in Hungary, their economic situation has improved enormously.
I speak about the Western middle class, not about Hungarian, because I mean...
Western middle class, well, it depends. It depends where. Yes, in France is terrible. Yes, it's true. In France, the situation of the middle class is terrible. In Britain, it's not very, very brilliant either. And Italy is in a crisis. Yes, there's a lot of trouble with the West. Yeah.
But what would you suggest as a way out of this situation? Do you see any sort of path which would lead us to a world which is better than today? Because you say Marxism is an interesting analysis, but not really a basis for political action. Everyone is sort of a liberal, then we have extreme right. So according to you and according to your values and positions, what would be the reasonable way to proceed?
There's no such way. Mm-hmm. We are headed towards catastrophe. And this catastrophe may be slow or maybe swift. I don't know.
Okay.
But it's not a question of values. It is a very strange situation in which there's an interesting mix of ideologies. So now, for example, we are both university people. So you know that our students hate capitalism with a passion. And they are really against exploitation, against capital, against especially financial capitalism and so on. That's one thing. But this won't even lead to the creation of a revolutionary student movement. Not even a small student movement, because there's no hope, there's no trust, and it is an expression of deep discomfort and hatred of the truly immoral and unjust society in which we live. Right. And these people are acting in practice, thinking as Marxists, but acting as liberals, demonstrating for human rights, basically. They may not call it that, but this is, they're demonstrating for gays, demonstrating for people of color, etc., against chauvinism, against anti-Semitism, against this and that and the other. So there's a dose of insincerity in this, But that's my situation too. I've written in favor of Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny is treated terribly by the Russian state, and I protest. But of course, would I wish to live in a state that is led by Alexei Navalny? Not for a second. His views are opposed. But what is my point of view here? Of course, it's the point of view of human rights that, according to Marx, is an illusion, isn't it? So, of course, we are all acting as liberals of one kind or another without really believing in it. Without really believing in it, look, against something that we, former sons and daughters of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, should know. Well, look at Musil, at Robert Musil.
But that's actually quite worrying, because that was like the decay of the monarchy. Nobody believed in anything. So I mean, I see two problems. There is some sort of nihilism, and then there are people who believe in something, and they can be actually quite dangerous. I mean, if I see the young Muslims in France who are actually turning, who are not, their problem is not if they are just Muslims, but if they actually turned into Islamist ideology and they believe in something. But
yes, they might believe in Islam, but also they're consuming drugs, which their religion bans and prohibits. They're not really Islamists.
No, it's
just desperate young people.
It's an ideology of Islamism. But, can we live somehow with the idea that nothing matters, all are illusions, and that actually...
No.
So
No, people are quite desperate. I mean, that's not, so I don't think that people think that nothing matters. They might actually become nihilistic as a result of disappointment. So say, if I can't believe in anything, okay, then let's have sex and tourism and music and wine.
That's hedonism, as a sort of liberal hedonism.
Well, that has appeared in history many, many times. That is boring. There's nothing new in this. As there is nothing new in fanaticism either. But what is quite special is this Austro-Hungarian version of nihilism that is called the parallel action by Musil in The Man Without Qualities, where people on the one hand do all this great action in the honor of the emperor, while of course laughing at him, but realizing that if we don't act sometimes, at least, as if we believed in something, we're fucked.
Well, I think this is
so people just are trying to behave as if they were religious, although they are not, like the young Islamists. Young Islamists are as modern as you and me, just as inconsequent. I mean, the sexual behavior of young Muslims is no different from the unbelieving sons and daughters of Christians. They're pretty promiscuous, and they drink, they're less, but they consume drugs a lot, and so on and so forth. So they're not. So those people would be punished by a real mullah or ayatollah of the past. The contemporary mullahs and ayatollahs are too clever. They know that if they go against the habits of the youth, they're lost. But you see, so this is how we live. And that is, as you say, it is quite dangerous, because concerted political action, concerted collective action is almost impossible. I mean, look at the climate crisis. The climate crisis would demand a retrenchment, a limitation of our pleasures. We should reduce lots of comforts, cars, flying, etc., and other things in order to help along the fight against pollution and so on and so forth. But in our experience, what ideologies were capable of convincing people to live more modestly than before? It is mostly religion, religious asceticism that convinced people that there are other things more important than earthly pleasures, right? And to a certain extent, nationalism, and to a certain extent, socialism has convinced people to give up some of their pleasures. That seems just about impossible.
Dear Gaspar, thank you very much, because I mean, this is a perspective from Central Europe. It's some sort of a Central European postmodernism, I would say, even though you may not agree with this label.
I don't.
Yeah, I believe that you don't. But, this idea that we are somewhere between nihilism and fanaticism and try to somehow struggle with it, that's something which I find actually quite interesting, and maybe actually may go beyond Central Europe. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you very much for this interview. Thank you.
Not at all. Bye. All the best to everybody.